What's up, y'all? This is Hammer here again, back on a video. And today I'm going to be talking about capitalism, but specifically, I'm going to be talking about how capitalism is now turning and, in many ways, devouring what we know as white supremacy. Now, a lot of people, when they hear capitalism, are going to think, oh, this guy's a communist, he's a socialist. And all that does is show me that people are just uneducated about what capitalism is and how it operates. So what I'm going to do here is this. I'm going to slowly break down to you just how capitalism works, its history, and how we got where we are. And I'm going to explain, why that matters in today's age, and also how this is going to prove my original premise of how capitalism is now turning against white supremacy and is now eating the same Western civilization that gave birth to it. Let's go back to the beginning, right? So, capitalism in its purest form essentially is the pursuit of endless growth through the pursuit of profits, right? The pursuit of endless growth through the pursuit of profits. Now, there are two issues with this philosophy, right? First is that this philosophy requires an exploitative system, and two, it is impossible to achieve endless growth in a world with finite resources. But let's just break down how this works, right? So the way capitalism essentially works in its purest form is that what it will do, it will extract labor at the cheapest way possible, and then use that extraction of labor in order to create industrial products. Those industrial products are then sold back into the market for profit. And this profit fuels the growth of capitalism and fuels the industrialization of the economy and of the nation in which it is operating under. This economic system is what allowed Europeans to go from being a backwater to essentially being an economic powerhouse and essentially becoming big boys on the global stage. And so, Europeans, now becoming stronger, becoming on a higher position on the global stage, decide to spread across the world and invade the globe. But as they invaded the globe and they captured territory and set up, colonies, they decided to further extract resources from those colonies, send them back towards Europe to fuel the growth and the profits of capitalism. Now, all is good and well. But like I said before, right, the two issues with two fundamental flaws of capitalism, right? The first flaw is that it's an exploitative system, and the second flaw is that it seeks endless growth. The first flaw is what, in many ways, almost caused capitalism to collapse in Europe. Although capitalism was fueling the rise of European powers, fueling the rise of European empires, because of how it worked, right, in which it extracted the labor at a lowest way possible within Europe to create industrial products and then sold the industrial products back to the market, it essentially meant that white people, Europeans, the European masses, were essentially being exploited twice. Because not only are you being worked to death in a factory for pennies on the dollar, but then the products that were created through your labor are then sold back to you at exorbitant prices, right? And whatever little money you did make from that slave labor gets essentially taken away from those by you buying those products. So in other words, your labor gets exploited, and then you get price gouged. This is what fuels the profits of capitalism, and this is what allows it to grow. And although this strengthened the European powers and made them strong, it was fundamentally a system that was so unequal that it could not last. And the European leaders, the European society could see that this was unsustainable. You can't have a situation where people are working, almost 24 hours a day for nothing, and then the little they do have essentially all gets absorbed by the extremely high products, industrial products. all to in which leads to all of the wealth and the profits going to the top 1%. Yes, this may cause the economy to grow. This may cause uh, uh, um, um, the country to industrialize. This may cause European powers to become more stronger, but it's at the expense of the what masses, 90% of the population. And so capitalism was facing an existential crisis. But capitalism, before it collapsed, was able to be saved through what? Through the labor rights and the workers' movements throughout Europe, in which Europeans advocated for strong reforms within capitalism, right? Whether it's, safety concerns, minimum wage, social welfare, you know, employee protections. All of these things will slowly build up over time, right? All these reforms to ensure that the wealth, the profits, and the growth that was being created through capitalism in Europe would be fairly redistributed or shared with the masses. And as Europeans expanded and created the white settler societies like in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, like in United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, right? Those white settler states, as they expanded to make the white settler states, whether it was Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, and as those white settler societies went through the same industrial cycle, they also went through the same period of, reforms in order for it to work. In fact, this picture is a good example. This picture you see on the screen is actually a picture from, the labor movement in America. See, Europe had already industrialized and went through it with labor movement and all of the reforms. When America went through its industrialization, they went through a similar movement. Come on, say, look, people need to understand, in its natural state, capitalism is going to seek to extract labor at the cheapest way possible and then sell the industrial products it created from that labor back to you in exorbitant prices. So it is trying to exploit you twice to fuel profits, to fuel endless growth, and to fuel the industrialization of the economy. But of course, this cannot work for most people. So what you're seeing here is that same thing happened in America. See, in Europe, they already went, they industrialized first. They already went through labor movement. They already went through all the union, all the labor reforms. In America, when America industrialized, we had a similar labor move here. Because in America, it was very, like day one in America, it was very common for folks to be working almost all day in the factory with no protections, doing nothing. If your hands got cut in the factory, oh well. So, like what you see with this picture, people had to fight for that. People in America had to fight for a 40-hour work week. They had to fight for minimum wage. They had to fight for Medicare, right? So all these things, right? In fact, this is what gave birth to the rise of Roosevelt and the New Deal. Because once again, capitalism in its natural state will extract everything and essentially go towards the top. And it's unsustainable because eventually it leads to the system collapsing on itself. Because you cannot have a situation where everybody is being extracted from, it's all concentrated to the top 1%. It's going to fall. And that's sort of what you saw with the Great Depression, what you saw with all the poverty that happened in the United States before the New Deal, right? How everyone was being extracted from, exploited. That's its natural state. And although this may, temporarily in the short term fuel the growth, fuel the industrialization, in the long term it becomes unsustainable. So capitalism only is able to survive, has only been able to survive because of all of the reforms that require and force it to redistribute the wealth that it creates, the profits, the growth that it creates towards the masses. And this will allows it to function, allows it to keep going. Why does that matter? It matters because what that means is that most Americans and most people in the West do not recognize that what you essentially have within the United States and within the West essentially is artificial. The natural state of capitalism is one in which it is going to try to exploit you as much as it possibly can, right? It's going to try to extract your labor and essentially, use your labor to create industrial products and sell those products back to you essentially at exorbitant prices in order to exploit you twice. That is the Natural state of capitalism. The only reason why in America and in the West you have Social Security, Medicare, social welfare, minimum wage, 40-hour work, all of those things only exist because of all of the reforms of capitalism that have protected you up until now. And every single time reforms are made, capitalism is always trying to fight to destroy those reforms, destroy those things, because it is always trying to go back to its original state. Now, why does that matter? What inspired me to make this video was that recently there's a story that's going viral in which Tyson Foods, a white-owned company, essentially laid off thousands of workers within Iowa, mostly white, and then went on to hire thousands of migrants in New York. And of course, you have white folks in the chat say, I can't believe that. Once again, this is what happens when you are uneducated. The only reason why we have all these protections, the only reason you have is because people had to fight for that. What you were seeing with Tyson Foods, of them laying off white workers and going hire migrants, that is the natural state of capitalism. If it wasn't for all of the labor laws and protections, in its natural state, capitalism is going to seek the cheapest labor, exploit that labor to create industrial products, and then sell those products back to you at exorbitant prices to make profits off of you while price gouging you. And those profits are going to go to the top 1%, and they're going to fuel the growth of the economy, fuel the industry of the economy at your expense. The only reason why in the West you've been able to have all these, toothpick, the house, the dog, the car, the unions, the pensions, all of that is only because of all of the reforms and constraints that were placed on capitalism. Without that, you will be in a factory working 24 hours with nothing. So what we are seeing here is that, one, because capitalism is an exploitative system, it is unsustainable. And so therefore, the only way it becomes sustainable is that it has to constantly be reformed. But here's the issue. Because reformed capitalism is not the natural state of capitalism, that means that every time you reform capitalism, capitalism is always going to try and find ways to break through those reforms and go back to its natural state of exploiting you, making you work for the cheapest. It's always going to go back to its natural state, in which it's going to seek the cheapest labor possible, exploit that labor to create industrial products, sell those products back to the consumer at exorbitant prices, exploit you by essentially price gouging you, and the profit it makes from that, it goes to 1% and fuels the growth. That's the natural state. Now, how does this then go back to the second point I made about endless growth? Right, so I already broke down how the system is unsustainable, right? The second part is, how does this tie into endless growth? In addition to the fact that, capitalism being an exploitative system makes it unsustainable, the second part is that its pursuit of endless growth is also unsustainable, right? What we are starting to see now is that after World War II, the Western world has reached the limits of growth and the limits of profits. What that means is that capitalism is no longer able to create the level of growth and profits that it once could in the West. It has now started to reach a limit of that, which is natural, because once again, everywhere around the world has finite number of people, finite number of resources, meaning that when capitalism takes over a certain region, it's only going to grow to a certain point. Why? Because if you have finite number of people and a finite number of resources, that means there's going to be a limit of how much you can grow, and it's going to be a limit of the amount of profit you can garner. And so naturally, right now, I will say after World War II, capitalism started to realize, okay, we are starting to reach the limits of growth and profits within the West. So the only way for capitalism to maintain, so to keep going and to keep growing, it has to expand to new economic landscapes. During this time period, capitalism is looking out saying, wait a minute, okay, Europe is now reaching its limit of growth, limit of profits. Where can we go to keep growing, right? So capitalism looks out and says, okay, we see Asia. Asia is the only continent that's growing demographically, which means they have a lot of people, which means that there's a lot of people that can be used for cheap labor, and there's a lot of people that can be used as a market to make a profit. And so this means that capitalism starts to make its move. After World War II, capitalism slowly shifts towards Asia, right? And Asia starts to go through the industrial cycle, right? And the same process occurs here, right? The large demographics of Asia gets turned into a large, the large population of Asia gets turned into a labor force. And this labor force, this cheap labor force, is extracted in order to create industrial products, and those industrial products are then sold back into the market of Asia, and the consumers of Asia for profit. This, of course, fuels the profits and the growth of Asia and allows Asia to industrialize. So capitalism, which was doing the same thing in Europe and fueling its growth and power, now that it has reached the limits of growth and the limits of profits in Europe, it is now expanding towards Asia to continue its growth and to continue its lust for profit. And Asia essentially went through the same process, right? Its large labor force will essentially turn into what, sweatshops, right? Turn into a labor class. Its large population was turned into a labor force. And this labor force essentially was exploited. The labor was exploited to create industrial products. Those industrial products were sold back into the market of consumers in Asia for profit, and the profits went towards the top 1%, fueling the growth of the Asian economy. But most importantly, this fueled the industrialization of Asia. So the same process that Europeans went through, right, that allowed capitalism to turn them into a powerhouse, capitalism essentially went towards Asia and is now doing that for them, right? Now, the only difference, though, is that because Europeans already went through all the labor movements, right, in Asia, Asians were able to get, I guess, a head step, because by the time factories started to get built, by the time folks started being worked to death, there were already pushes to put constraints, right? Oh, you can't work us there, right? But once again, those were slow, right, to come. But the point is that capitalism is now making its way towards Asia. That's the reason why I said, look, Asia, by the middle of the century, by 2050, Asia is going to become the center of industrial capitalism. Asia is going to become the center of the capitalist economy. In fact, China is already the biggest industrial power in the world. China industrialized to what? Slave shops, to sweatshops, working folks to death. That's how capitalism works. And so once capitalism realized, okay, we have reached the limits of profits and growth we can extract from the West, we have to move out to keep growing. They went towards Asia and they did the same thing there, right? They took the large population, they turned them into essentially a slave labor class. They exploited that labor to create the industrial products. They sold the industrial products back into the sort of consumers of Asia, right, and turned them into a market, consumers of Asia, and then through the selling of the industrial products back into the consumers of Asia, they were able to make a profit and fuel the growth of Asia. And this, of course, allowed Asia to industrialize and slowly become the new center of capitalism. Now, here's the problem. This is not forever. This will only keep going until what? Until Asia reaches the limits of growth. The same way capitalism operated in Europe and in the West until it reached the limits of growth, the same thing will happen in Asia. So now Asia is slowly industrializing, is becoming the new center of capitalism, it's growing economically, it's going through the same process of, labor being extracted and products being sold back to consumers. It's going through the same products. It's going through the same process. When Asia reaches the limits of growth and the limits of profits, capitalism will leave Asia and go somewhere else, which is Africa, because Africa right now is the only continent that's growing demographically. Now, the problem with this is that as time goes on, capitalism is going to keep going around the world, and eventually capitalism would have ended up absorbing the entire planet, and every part of the globe would have essentially become an industrial, if not post-industrial economy. And every part of the world would have reached the limits of good and profits. Now, when that happens, capitalism will have nowhere to go. and there will be nowhere else to go to fuel its profits and to fuel its growth. And at that point, the system collapses. That's the second weakness of capitalism, that because of its pursuit of growth to its pursuit of profits, it means that because it is operating on the planet with finite resources, that means that eventually, once it absorbs the entire planet, it will have nowhere else to go. And once the entire global economy has reached the limits of growth and profits, capitalism will collapse on itself. That's why I keep saying, look, this century is the Asian century, and the next century is the African century. Why? Because, look, capitalism went from Europe and went towards Asia because, once again, Europe had to reach the limits of growth and profits. In order for it to keep growing, in order for it to keep growing in profits, it had to go to someone else. And because Asia at the time had the largest population, it meant that it was ripe for that, because that large population can be turned into a slave labor class to produce industrial products, and industrial products could be sold back into that large population as a consumer class in order to make profits. And those profits could go to the top 1%, to fuel the profits, to fuel the growth, and to fuel the industrialization, thus making Asia the new center of capitalism. And of course, this is going to keep going until Asia reaches the limits of growing, the limits of profit, in which capitalism would then move on to another territory, which is going to be Africa, because by the time Asia reaches the limits of growth and profits, Africa will be the only continent that's growing demographically. It will probably be the largest demographic continent, so capitalism will go on there too. And then when it's done with Africa, it'll keep going to somewhere else until the entire globe essentially is absorbed by capitalism. And once that happens, it would have reached the limits of growth and profit, and it will collapse on itself. And so what I'm saying here is that, like my premise, because of capitalism's pursuit of endless growth through the pursuit of profits, it essentially means that the same economic system which allowed Europe to go from a backwater to being an economic power, the same economic system that allowed the West to dominate the globe is now going to turn on it, because in order for it to continue its philosophy of endless growth through endless profits, it must now go beyond the West. It must now turn on the West and empower other continents in order for it to continue growing, in order for it to continue extracting profits. And it will make its way around the globe until there is nowhere left to go. There's no more growth left. There's no more profits to be made. And at that point, it's over. With that being said, that's my view there. And I hope I was able to perfectly break down my thesis to why I believe that capitalism, the economic system that sort of gave birth to the West, is now turning on the West. And ironically, it's also now facilitating its decline. Y'all tell me in the chat what you guys think, if you agree, disagree, or not. But with that being said, hammer out.